This woman on screen holds true stories like you wouldn't believe. She's been dubbed the most evil woman in the history of mankind. With both the appearance and profession of a full-time abbess, Mariam Solicitis deceived everyone around her for decades. Her main reasons? Money and power. By the end of her reign, Mariam Solicitis would be arrested and known as the Nun serial killer. This is no horror movie script. This is unfortunately a...
The opening hits like a gut punch. Mariam Solicitis, a nun dubbed the most evil woman. It's chilling to think someone cloaked in faith could hide such darkness. Her story isn't just about crime, it's about betrayal, using religion to prey on the vulnerable. As we dive into her world, ask yourself, how could a place meant for salvation become a house of horrors? The contrast between her holy image and her actions is what makes this case so haunting.
Mariam Solicitis was born in 1883 in Greece. Belonging to an impoverished family, she didn't have much to look forward to. So she continued to work at her family farm. Despite her humble background, Mariam had high aspirations. She dreamt of a life of wealth and power. Some accounts suggest that Mariam worked at a factory to earn daily wages for her family. It's easy to imagine what kind of life Mariam was living before she became a nun. Waking up at dawn and having a simple breakfast, or maybe no breakfast at all, depending upon the availability of food in the house. Working on the farm could not have been fun for a teenage girl. Getting a job at a factory would not have made things any easier. However, she did not lose her grit, or better yet, the rigor to become a formidable personality. Since Mariam didn't have many prospects for earning, she chose the one path that could help her make her dreams come true. She decided to become a nun and join the old Calandrous Church. Matthew Carpathakis was the head monk of the Calandrous Church when Mariam was 23 years old. The meeting took place when Matthew was having trouble accepting the tenets of the old Calandrous Church. He was completely alienated from the teachings of the old church and decided to start a new convent. As luck would have it, Mariam joined Matthew when he started his sect, called the New Calandrous Church, and Mariam Solicitis became Mariam. Mariam rose through the church ranks and soon became a confidant of the Archbishop Matthew of Viresnum. When Matthew entered into a conflict with the old Calandrous Church, Mariam was by his side. They laid the foundation of the Panagia Fefkuno Monastery, or the Convent of the Virgin, in the Pines in 1927, located between the town of Kirtea and the rural villages of Karke, Thulasa. Matthew had been planning to set up his own monastery for the last few years, and Mariam helped to get him access to the land. She came into an additional 7 acres of land, and later that year, she acquired 2 more plots of land. No one knows how she was able to secure so much property. The Greek author Nila Koulataki writes, having reviewed long, sympathetic, Matthewite histories of the monastery, there is no legal explanation as to how the nuns acquired the money to make these expensive property purchases. The official announcement made by Matthew at the unveiling of the monastery was to honor the presentation of the Virgin Mary. However, the true reason for building the monastery was to gather funds desperately needed to support the old Calandrous movement. Both Mariam and Matthew were tactful in hiding their true intentions when they started this new convent. They were the face of honesty, integrity, and faith for the very people who were innocent enough to believe in them. Faith was indeed the driving force for the believers of the Calandrous movement. Of course, the movement would have continued to thrive if its proponents were as devoted as they seemed to be. Things might not have taken such a dark turn if Mariam had the same faith as those around her. She would not have resorted to violence, extortion, and outright blackmail. if she held on to her own faith. Building a monastery is not an easy task, especially when you have limited funds. The fact that Mariam and Matthew were able to build a monastery from scratch seemed miraculous, not to say the least. None of the founding nuns came from money, so how did they collect all the church resources? The mysterious funding had a gruesome truth at its core, which would soon come to the surface. The Convent of the Virgin in Pine was advertised as a healing center for tuberculosis, or TB. The monastery was built at a high altitude, and since there wasn't a cure for TB at the time, people who did not have the means to get medical treatment came to the monastery as a safe haven. People started to come to the monastery in throngs so they could heal themselves, and Mariam welcomed them with pleasure. Although there was no particular medical facility available at the monastery, people were excited to venture into the fold of this new sect. Mariam would settle multiple patients into a single room. She would not let any doctors visit the patients unless they had to sign a death certificate. This negligent practice would have gone unnoticed if Mariam had not started another gruesome practice.
Hearing about the monastery's healing promise for TB patients breaks my heart. These people were desperate, clinging to hope, only to be met with neglect and exploitation. Mariam's refusal to allow doctors wasn't just careless, it was a death sentence. The law calls this negligent homicide, but it feels like cold-blooded betrayal. How could someone exploit such suffering for profit? It's a stark reminder that power can corrupt absolutely even in a sacred place. The victim's trust in her was their downfall, and that injustice
She saw how
stings.
Matthew ran the activities of the monastery. She had to take over some of the responsibilities when Matthew was taken to prison. After he came back, he continued on a spiritual journey as a Harrow monk. He would do 40-day fasts and stay in isolation to get close to God. While Matthew was going through his spiritual journey with heavy metal chains tied around his waist, his apprentice decided to put others under duress. Little did Matthew know that the sweet-looking Mariam would turn out to be a tyrant in his own monastery. When Matthew was on his deathbed, Archbishop Chrysostomos of Florina came to visit him. The Archbishop wanted to bury the hatchet and possibly end the division in the Calandrous Church. Before Matthew could try to say anything to Chrysostomos, Mariam barged into the room with all the nuns and told them to leave. We can only speculate how the healing of the division would have came about. We can never know what kind of effects it would have had on the future of the Calandrous Church, as Mariam had snuffed out all hope for an agreement. Archbishop Matthew's health had started to decline in 1939, and Mariam was now in charge of the monastery. By this point in Matthew's life, he was only a shadow of his former self. He had to rely on Mariam to make important decisions, and soon left everything under her supervision. After waiting for 11 years, Mariam was finally given the title of Mother of Mariam of Kiratea. Her lifelong ambition of gaining control was complete. She was the abbess of the Fef Kunogo Trisa Monastery. She would wear the Greek-style cloth head covering, a black veil that covered her forehead and eyebrows. This piece of clerical clothing was only worn by high-ranking Eastern Orthodox nuns. She had decided to gather as much wealth as she could. She did not care what method she had to use to get the job done. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when Mariam descended into murderous wrath. However, it is evident that she started her ascetic practices soon after she became an abbess. Her strong character had evolved into a formidable force. She wanted to amass as much wealth for her monastery as she could. When the news of Mariam's activities was made public, she was named Mother Rasputin by the media. Giving to charity may seem like the most humane thing a person can do, but what if that donation is based on fear? That is exactly what Mariam did. Her crimes went far beyond the suspicions of illegal imports that she was first convicted of. She had destroyed a number of lives by trying to treat patients suffering from TB. With many people suffering from isolation and pain, Mariam was involved in hundreds of negligent homicides. She collected millions of dollars worth of property in the names of girls' dowries. She could first trap a wealthy family by promising them salvation. If they did not agree, she would tie them up in her basement and torture them until they succumbed to her wishes. She would lock people up until they died of starvation. Nobody knows exactly how many people were doomed to the fate obtained by the abbess of the monastery, but a total of 27 murders were estimated by the Greek police. Mr. and Mrs. Becca were devout followers of the Calandrist Church. They were impressed by the courage shown by the Archbishop Matthew and his monastery. Mrs. Becca's theological bent toward the church led her to studying with Mariam Solicitis. Alas, she was not aware of the horrendous practices of the so-called abbess. She had already pledged her whole property to the church, but when she realized that Mariam was resorting to violence to get her way, she tried to leave with her 2 children. Mariam couldn't bear to lose such a golden opportunity and locked Mrs. Becca in a cell. Mrs. Becca was forced to live in a cell where patients with TB had died. She would wail and cry out for help, but no one could hear her pleas. Since the monastery was on top of a mountain, it proved to be the perfect dungeon for Mariam's diabolical plans. She would only allow a few mouthfuls of food to be given to the imprisoned Mrs. Becca. When Mariam decided to release Mrs. Becca, the woman was a mere shell of her former self. She fell into a coma, and Mariam did not do anything to help the woman. Instead, she let Mrs. Becca rot and die in the prison she called the monastery. Mr. Becca was also placed in isolation until he fell ill and succumbed to a lonely and painful death. Imagine visiting a monastery to get spiritual enlightenment and then coming back with nothing but an empty bank account. Unfortunately, the next victims, Mr. and Mrs. Panna Yadapolio, were not lucky enough to get away with their lives or their home. Mariam told them that they would be cleared of all their sins if they joined her. Instead, she held them hostage and starved them until they put their property in Mariam's name. Mariam was not one to leave loose threads and decided that it would be best if the Panayotopoulios would leave this world once and for all. Getting a TB diagnosis was a death sentence in the early 1900s. Doctors could only lessen the patient's pain as they had no cure. Miss Mikalakou received her death sentence when she was told she had TB. When she heard the convent of the Virgin was offering treatment for her disease, she was overjoyed. When she arrived at the monastery, she was expecting some type of spiritual treatment. She was horrified when the nuns took her to a cell and left her there. She wasn't given any medicines and was only fed a few tiny meals. Soon, Miss Mikalakous began to get weaker. She suffered the same fate as many others under Miriam's ruthless supervision. She died alone and in agony, without a single loved one by her side. Not everyone living under Mariam's rule was happy with the way she conducted her business. Sister Theodote tried to speak out against the abbess's cruel method, but Mariam was not one to take this lightly. She accused Sister Theodote of misconduct and ordered that the nuns should be beaten as a punishment. The rest of the nuns had no choice but to follow the orders. They beat Sister Theodote until she suffered an internal hemorrhage. She died on the spot because of the intense beating and had paid her penance for disagreeing with the abbess. Anyone who tried to stand against Mother Rasputin would face her wrath. Sister Maria also spoke out against Mariam and was punished with a ruthless beating. When she arrived at the hospital, she was injured beyond recognition. She had internal bleeding, with her vital organs damaged. The doctors tried to save her life, but no form of medical treatment can compensate for the brutality meted out by Mariam Solicitis. Sister Maria took her last breath and was finally released from the clutches of the Calandras Church.
The stories of Mrs. Becca, Miss Mikalaku, and Sister Theodote are gut-wrenching. Starvation, torture, beatings, these weren't just crimes, they were acts of unimaginable cruelty. Mariam didn't just steal property, she stole lives, leaving families shattered. Legally, her actions amount to murder and extortion, but the human cost is what hits hardest. Imagine the terror of being locked in a cell, crying for help, with no one coming. It's infuriating to think she hid behind a nun's veil while committing these atrocities. This case screams for justice, and I'm relieved the police finally
denied that Mariam Solicitis had anything to do with the murders. However, there have been multiple witness statements that say otherwise. Solicitis would lure innocent people into her monastery and promise them salvation. Instead, they would be tied up in a basement and forced to transfer all of their property to Mariam's name. Mariam was tried for 7 murders. Authorities estimated that she had killed at least 27 people by starvation, negligent homicides, and beatings in the name of penance. Religious figures hold authority over people. Mariam Solicitis' crimes went undetected because no one believed that she could be capable of such villainy. Had she been an ordinary woman, things would have been completely different. As luck would have it, Mariam continued to send monks all across Greece to find wealthy spinsters, widows, and families. She would lure these innocent believers into donating to the monastery and steal the donations. One day, the police received an anonymous tip. The source informed the police that an elderly woman had donated all of her property to the monastery. The woman's daughter was certain that her mother would not have pledged the money without being forced. This accusation was not enough to put Mariam under arrest. The police started investigating Mariam's mysterious sources of wealth. They discovered that the abbess was involved in the illegal import of olive oil and other spices. However, the charge of illegal imports was not enough to arrest a high-profile figure like Mariam. After some time, a woman named Eugenia Margetta came forward stating that she was held in isolation by the monastery's abbess. She further alleged that she had been tortured to surrender her property, worth $118 million, which was equivalent to $80,000 US at the time. In 1949, Christos Spirides went to the Greek police searching for his daughter, Samila Spirides, who went missing that year. The FBI traced Samila back to the monastery. The father of the 18-year-old girl said that he had been convinced by a nun named Mariam to give away property worth $10,000 US. He told the police that the nun had visited the United States to collect the property donated to the monastery. The Associated Press later revealed that Christo was reunited with his daughter. The police continued to investigate the allegations made against Mariam Solicitis. They found out that the monastery practiced asceticism and did not allow any doctors to treat patients suffering from TB. Almost 150 people died due to the absence of medical treatment while they were staying at the monastery. As the investigation continued, the police discovered various victims who talked about the abbess who used to beat them for small misdemeanors. She was in the habit of locking up her victims in solitary confinement. Those who survived revealed how Mariam used to stare at them until they would crumble and transfer their properties in her name. The news agency Reuters reported at the time of her arrest, Mariam had almost 300 homes and farms in her name. Moreover, she had collected gold and jewels worth thousands of pounds during her treacherous reign as Mother Rasputin. On the night of the 4th of December, 1950, when Mariam Solicitis was sound asleep in her magnificent chambers, the police entered the monastery. A total of 85 police officers searched the grounds of the monastery. They had anticipated the murders committed by Mariam and brought a deputy prosecutor, a judge, and a coroner with them. The operation lasted throughout the night. They rescued 36 children. The police had to physically grab the children from the hands of the nuns. According to the police, they were also rescued. Several half-naked, malnourished, and sick elderly women tied up in basements. The case of Mariam Solicitis was extremely sensitive. The prosecutors were not sure whether they would be able to convict her on the charges of fraud and embezzlement. They began her trial under the charge of importing illegal olive oil and tires. However, the authority of the Calandrist Church would soon end. Mariam's worship, called the Matthewites, was outlawed in January 1951. The Archbishop Spiridion Vlachos of Athens and the Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina could not reconcile their differences. The old Calandrist Church was dismantled, and Mariam could not use religion as an excuse for her heinous crimes. The public prosecutor was free to indict the ruthless nun, and he did not spare a single detail of her life of crime. He indicted Solicitis with all the crimes she had committed in the last 10 years, including homicide, fraud, forgery of wills, blackmail, and torture. Solicitis continued to portray herself as a pious nun during her trials. She wore an Orthodox icon honoring the late Matthew, ordaining him with the name Saint Matthew, the new confessor. She rejected all charges against her, calling them satanic fictions. Maybe Mariam had convinced herself that everything she had done was in the name of religion. You could say that Mariam had brought back the Salem witch trials, where innocent people were hanged to death to let the church take over their property. She stood in the courtroom like a cold, heartless monster whose only aim was to satisfy her own greed. As she heard the charges brought against her, she would cross herself and make a prayer of vengeance to Saint Matthew. She knew that she did not have any defense, no matter what legal loop.
The police raid was a turning point, but Miriam's trials reveal her true character, defiant, praying for vengeance while facing overwhelming evidence. Seeing her followers still defend her, blinded by faith, is maddening. The legal system held her accountable, but 14 years feels too short for 177 estimated victims. This case exposes how unchecked power and greed can twist even sacred institutions. It's a warning to question authority, no matter how holy it seems. Mariam's legacy isn't piety, it's a trail of broken lives.
People who came into the monastery would take a vow of property. They would hand over all of their property to the monastery of their own free will. He claimed that the property was transferred to Mariam's name because the monastery did not have a legal setup. The enormity of Mariam's crimes resulted in 3 separate trials. The first trial was conducted in the years 1951 and 1952. The second one continued into 1953, and the third and last trial was concluded a few months before her death. She was convicted for 26 months after her first trial, 10 years after the second trial, and 4 consecutive months in her last trial. Mariam's sentence in 1951 came as a shock to Matthewites all across Greece. They held a rally to liberate their leader from the clutches of the legal system. They demanded that she should be released and returned to her rightful place. The police had to protect the Archbishop Spiridion. There was a dangerous possibility of the Calandrists kidnapping the Archbishop and demanding Mariam's release in prison. Mariam Solicitis was incarcerated in the Avrof prison located on Alexander's Avenue in Athens. She spent the last part of her life as isolated as her victims, but she did not suffer the same end. The total length of her sentence was 14 years, but she only spent a year or so in prison before she fell ill. She was rushed to the hospital where she died at the age of 71. Solicitis had more than 400 followers when she was in power. almost 500 people gave away their property to the monastery by drafting a will in Mariam's name. The same number of people died in the monastery due to disease, starvation, or torture. The Matthewite nurses continued to pray for the intercession of Holy Mariam, as they think she is the model of purity and piety. The Calandrists continued to thrive under new leadership. No one knows who took over from the formidable Mariam Solicitis. The woman who continued would vanish without a trace. They were adept at hiding their identity as well as their location. They revered Mariam Solicitis as their true saint and claimed that the male priests and monks were jealous of Mariam's success. When asked about the hundreds of deaths in the monastery,